Hello, my name is Jennifer. So today I'll be discussing the history of voting and voting rights in the US and why it matters. Imagine a time in America when only white land-owning men had the right to vote. This was the reality at the nation's founding. It didn't matter whether you were black, Latino, Native American, your race did not matter. What mattered is that you had to be white and you had to be male and you had to own property. Only and only then were you allowed to go to the ballot. However, for centuries, the struggle to expand voting rights has been a battle for the soul of the democracy of this country. From the bloody fights of racial and gender equality to the ongoing wars over voter suppression and access, the story of voting rights in the history is the story of America itself. So today I want to take you through this history and explain why securing these rights remain vital for the future of this nation. So for discussion, first I'm going to explore the history and evolution of voting rights in the US. Then I'll discuss the importance of voting in a democracy. Then I'll also go on to examine the voting disparities that still exist today. And then I'll still delve into the modern challenges of voting rights, and then finally we shall consider the reforms needed to strengthen voting rights and why your single vote holds immense power to shape this country's future. So first and foremost, I want us to discuss the history. During the early voting rights, so the journey of voting rights in the United States began before the nation was actually formally established. Initially, voting was a privilege reserved for white male property owners. This was actually a reflection of the British colonial practices and societal norms at the time, where only people that owned property, men that owned property, were allowed to go to the ballot. The founding fathers, so despite these revolutionary ideas, they did not extend this right to vote to women, to black people, to Native Americans, to any other race that was in the US. Although they were trying to expand these voting rights, they were only looking at white people. They didn't think about the women, they didn't think about the black people, they didn't think about the Native Americans. So that was during the early days of the voting rights and the struggles to ensure that everyone else gets to the ballot. From that moment came to the 15th Amendment. That was a landmark change. So this was like the first significant change that came with the 15th Amendment, and that happened in 1870. So what was so special about this 15th amendment? It stated that the right to vote could not be denied based on your race, based on your color, based on previous conditions of servitude. Okay, so this was a step forward, particularly for black men who had been enslaved, because they didn't have any rights. They didn't have the rights to vote. They couldn't voice their concerns in any way. So they looked at the 15th Amendment as something that was saving them, something that was giving them a voice, something that was giving them a power to go on and do what? And vote. Okay. But however, this reality was actually far from being realized, because the southern state, as soon as the 15th Amendment came to power, the southern states, Louisiana, for example, quickly jumped and enacted the Jim Crow laws, including the literacy tests, the poll tests, and other discriminatory practices, just to disenfranchise the black voters. So, for example, the literacy test, you had to answer about 68 questions on why you should vote, why you think you should, and so many other questions, and someone had to determine whether you passed or you did not pass those questions. So those were so many, that was just putting like a bottleneck and discouraging so many people from voting. The poll taxes, you had to pay money to go to the ballot, etc., etc. That was just a bottleneck to stifle, especially the Africans. Remember, these were slaves. These are people who came from Africa. They had their native language. They didn't speak English, but then they came to the US and they were forced into working as slaves instead of going to school, instead of building themselves, etc., etc. So that meant they didn't have property, they didn't go to school, they didn't know English. So this introduction literacy tests and poll taxes was just meant to, make it so hard for them to actually go and vote. So much as the 15th Amendment came into play to, to allow everyone to vote, the southern states say no. They went on to enact such laws, which actually made it so hard for the black voters to, go to the ballot and vote. I don't know if you can see this. Okay, my lighting is somehow, I don't know. My lighting, but this, what I have on my screen here is what some of the questions that you had to, this was some of the questions in the literacy test that you had to answer, and this was retweeted from the state of Louisiana back in the years. So you could see that they had 68 questions that they needed to answer, so that was really hard for them. And then even with that, the people back in the days did not stop at that. So when the 15th Amendment came in, and it was allowing people to vote, the women's suffrage movement also came into place. Now that was the next major milestone that was passed in the 19th Amendment, and that amendment happened in 1920. So this amendment granted women the right to vote. Okay, and so this victory kind of culminated into decades-long struggles led by, these women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth, and so many other women. So they kept knocking on doors. They kept pushing for women to ensure that women went to the ballot, much as they were provided for by the 15th Amendment. Some states said no, so they came up with all these movements to ensure that women actually went to the ballot. So the 15th Amendment came in, the women's suffrage movement came in with the 19th Amendment in 1920, and then came the Civil Rights era. So despite all these amendments, many Americans still faced significant barriers to voting. So the Civil Rights movement happened between 1950s and 1960s. So it brought so many issues at the forefront. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and organizations such as the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference fought tirelessly to end racial discrimination in voting. Their efforts resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a landmark legislation that prohibited racial discrimination in voting. So this act enforced the 15th Amendment and dismantled many of the barriers that had been enacted to prevent black Africans from voting. So it's like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave more meaning to the 15th Amendment. So it kind of just dismantled all those other limitations to voting. And to date, things are still happening. It's not like people have more rights to vote today. People have more rights to, vote and shape the democracy of their country, but it's not entirely, this right has not entirely been realized, because even as we speak today, there are still some states that have poll taxes that still require IDs, etc. But we'll discuss them in the next chapters. So next I want to move on to the modern threats now to voting. What are some of the hiccups that are still present that prevent people from, going to the ballot and etc. So we're saying that despite the progress that was made in expanding voter rights, disparities in voter turnout still persist, with some groups such as the racial minorities and low-income individuals participating at lower rates than others. We still have people with low income, racial minorities, they still don't go to the ballot to date. And then there's this strict voter ID laws that disenfranchise eligible voters. So what they've come up now, people are required to have voting IDs. If you don't have that specific ID, you cannot vote. I have something here on my phone. I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if something. Okay, I'll just read it for you. This is from the state of Louisiana. And it says, Southern states pushing new voting restrictions ahead of the 2024 elections. You see, even to this day, people are still pushing so many restrictions, still putting in so many restrictions to just, push certain people away from getting into the ballot. So one of the things that Louisiana is still enforcing is the voter ID. So right now, if you don't have a voter ID, you may not be allowed to vote in certain states. So that in itself is still a struggle, because if someone, for example, have their national ID, the state ID, let's say, and they have a driver's license, that should tell you that they are adults and they can vote. But apparently, if you do not have that voter ID in certain states, you cannot vote. So that becomes a challenge, even in today's world, where people are moving from, expressing themselves more at the ballot than it is today. And then there's a lot of disinformation. Disinformation, spreading lies about voting and election, and these all things undermine confidence in the electoral processes and can deter people from voting. People are still spreading a lot of false information and putting the lives of others in danger. For example, in the recently concluded debate, one of the presidential candidates said people in Springfield were eating dogs, they were eating cats, they were eating all the pets that belong to the people that they found. That is lies. That is some of the lies that can cause people to live in fear, can cause people to fail to express themselves. So such misinformation, such lies still happens today, and it can really, really, really provide a barrier for people to go out there and vote. And then the other thing is, the other modern threats to voting is people are not sensitized. People don't know the importance of why they should go and vote. People don't know that is how they can decide how they want their next 4 years to look like. So many of those things are still, cutting up people from going to vote. But here's the thing. The power to vote is in your hands, actually. Which takes me to my next, point. Voting is essential for a healthy democracy. If people are not voting, if people are not deciding on who they want to lead them, on who they want to be their presidents, on who they want to be their senators, they are not exercising their democracy. So for there to be a healthy democracy, people must be able to vote. Okay, so voting helps you to decide. It's a democratic process that helps you to decide who you want to lead you for the next so many years. And that is a right that every citizen should have, must have, and it shouldn't be taken away from anyone just because of their color, just because of their race, background, and their financial standings. The other thing that voting can do is that it helps you to hold the leaders accountable. If you vote for someone, a leader in office, you have the power to hold them accountable because you entrusted them that they will deliver certain services that they promised they would. If you do not vote, you don't have such powers, because then you had an option to either not vote, because your vote makes a difference. Just by one vote, it makes a lot of difference. So if you do not vote, you cannot hold your leaders accountable. So voting has that power to enable citizens hold their leaders accountable. Okay, so that's why I will still encourage everyone, please go and vote. So I just want to summarize everything that I've said. The history of So in conclusion, I want to let us know that the history of voting rights in the US is a story of both progress and ongoing struggles. We've not yet reached there, but we're not where we used to be in terms of voter rights and allowing more people to go to the ballot. So while we have made significant strides toward universal suffrage, challenges persist, and it is incumbent upon us to continue fighting for the voting rights of all citizens. Voting is the lifeblood of our democracy, and protecting and expanding voting rights is crucial for the health of this nation. We've journeyed through the history of voting rights, the modern threats we face, and the immense power of your single vote. By understanding the history of voting rights, the importance of voting, the disparities that exist, and the challenges we face, we can work towards a more just and equitable democracy where every citizen has equal voice. Don't just complain about the state of your country. Change it. Register to vote, cast your ballot, and fight to protect and expand voting rights. The democracy of this country depends on it. The vote is the great equalizer in a democracy, and we must do everything in our power to protect and expand voting rights for they are the foundation upon which our democracy is built. Nobody is free until everybody is free. So let us honor the legacy of our founding fathers by continuing to fight for the universal suffrage and a truly representative democracy. The power is in your hands. Use it wisely. Go and vote. Thank you.